Hello and welcome to this Pro Tools Tech Talk session where we're going to be looking at the new hybrid engine for Pro Tools HDX. My name is Dave Tyler. I work for Avid as an audio solution specialist based in the UK. And
Hi there. Hi, I'm Daniel, and I'm also an audio application specialist based in Tokyo, Japan.
Cool.
Looking forward to talking to everyone today about this really exciting announcement.
So Dan and I will we've got some, a few different things to show you, and we'll be interacting with you, and there'll be an opportunity for you to get involved as well and asking questions. So for those people who are on the Zoom call, again, we've got a fantastic number, so thanks everyone for coming and joining. If you're on the Zoom call, then you can get involved by using the Q&A function. So on Zoom, you click Q&A, ask your question. We have Gil and Jeff on hand who will be able to answer questions, but also if we think there's something that we can maybe discuss a little bit more or be useful for everyone to hear the answer, then we can answer that question live. We also are streaming on a number of social media platforms, on Avid's Facebook and Pro Tools feeds, on YouTube, on LinkedIn. So if you're on any of those platforms, we have people from Avid there as well. They'll make themselves known to you. You can ask them questions, they can reply. But again, if there's something which would be a good discussion point, they can bring the question over and we can answer it on the Zoom session too. So as I say, lots of opportunities for you to get involved. So this is how the session is going to look. I want to talk a little bit about kind of where we're coming from, the history of DSP, and why it's still applicable. We'll look at the HDX system and how it's designed, how it works today, and then Dan will take us on to look at how the hybrid engine changes that workflow, and we'll give you some practical demonstrations in Pro Tools, and then finish off with a kind of look at the difference between the two engines that we will have, the classic HDX engine and the new hybrid engine. So first up, a little bit of history. And talking of history, actually, as many of you will know, Pro Tools is reached its 30th birthday, which is an amazing milestone. And it's really obviously a piece of software that stood the test of time. And I think one of the things which really helped sort of Pro Tools in the early days, it was one of the sort of earliest computer-based audio workstations. So it was, you could buy an off-the-shelf computer, but then you add a DSP card because the computers were not really capable of processing the audio, let alone even the graphics. So you needed outboard DSP in order to process the audio. And of course, and DigiDesign as a company was really at kind of the forefront of that, the beginning of that development. But over time, we've sort of the DSP and the CPU have switched places. So there comes a tipping point where the CPU's taken over, and then we got to the point now where, I mean, if you buy a fully kitted out Mac Pro, you just have insane amounts of DSP, of CPU power, insane amounts of native processing. But we still have HDX, and the question is why? Why do we still need DSP-based systems? What does it give you that just running sort of raw CPU power doesn't? So this is actually a diagram from a blog article that was written when we sort of first came out with HDX and moved to the AX 64-bit platform. And actually, it's still really relevant. I think it's a really great example of where the strengths lie in DSP versus native. So what native gives you is it gives you all the power that you need from your CPU. And it can give you low latency, but it can't give you the power and low latency at the same time. There's always a trade-off, and that comes in the form of the hardware buffer size. If you want low latency, you set a low buffer size, but then you have a reduced power. You can't run complex mixes. What HDX does is it gives you this predictable system. So that's what we call determinism. So essentially, HDX, the DSP chips are not doing anything else. They're not running an operating system. They're not having, don't have a browser running in the background. All the things that your CPU might be doing, they're solely dedicated to the task of processing audio. And therefore, they do that, and they do it really, really well. They do it predictably, and you have this low latency across the board. So regardless of how complex your mix is, you're always going to have that same low latency from your HDX system, and that's really what HDX gives you. So HDX today, that HDX card is doing an awful lot of work. It's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. It's all your mixer is running on the DSP. Your voice handling is coming from the FPGA on the card. You're running plugins on the DSP, and of course you can run them on the host as well. But that HDX DSP is also taking care of, or the HDX card rather, is taking care of the I/O as well. So there's an awful lot of things hinging on this kind of one piece of hardware. And as I say, it does an amazing job, and we'll dig into that and to where its strengths are. But I think one thing that we want to do, which is where the hybrid engine comes in, is looking at extracting some of these things that we're allowing the HDX card to do, and putting those elsewhere in our system so that we get the best of all worlds. So before we move into that, I want to spend just a moment talking about tracks and voices. And the reason for doing this is that as we go on and talk about the hybrid engine, we're going to talk about voices, we're going to talk about tracks, and I think it's important that we all kind of understand where we're coming from, what we mean by these this terminology. So in Pro Tools world, a voice is used when you stream audio from the disc into your mixer. When you're using voices, you need one for every single audio path. So if it's just a mono path, then it's one voice, but a stereo path requires two, a 5.1 path requires 6 voices, and so on. So it's important to understand that kind of relationship between voices and width. So in Pro Tools, it's the audio track's job to take that audio from disc. So it's streaming the audio from disc, and that's where the voice comes in. So an audio track will use up voices. An audio track uses, a stereo audio track uses 2, 5.1 audio track uses 6 voices, and so on and so on. So that's the different. There's an important distinction there between tracks and voices. Another important thing to bear in mind is that mixer paths don't require voices. So if you've got aux inputs in your session, they don't use up your voice count. So as you're routing audio around your mixer, you're not using up voices along the way. So the way that we talk about voice limits when it comes to Pro Tools Ultimate depends on your audio hardware. So with HDX, obviously we're talking about specifically here, the voice count is tied to the hardware. So you get 256 voices per card at 48 kilohertz. If you're running a native system, so HD native or using a Core Audio or ASIO interface, then you have 384 voices at 48 kilohertz. And the important caveat here is that as it stands today, as you double your sample rate, you're halving your voice count. So if you're running at 96K, you only get 128 voices per card, and so on. So that's an important point to bear in mind at this stage. So as I say, this is a bit of a kind of a diversion from the part of the hybrid engine, but I think it's important to understand what tracks and voices are all about as we kind of move on and understand the terminology. So here are some sort of basics about HDX. This is how it works today, and it highlights maybe some of the limitations that we have with HDX as it is today. So with HDX, the mixer is hosted on the DSP chips on the card. Now that's fine if you're creating like a decent sized music mix, which is it's only stereo, maybe some routing things around. It's things are reasonably straightforward. But as you move into multi-channel mixing, 5.1, 7.1, and especially going up to Atmos mixing, you can find that actually the DSP that you've got on your HDX card starts to become completely consumed by the mixer, and therefore you have no DSP power being left for DSP plugin processing. So that's a problem that we find users are running into. The second thing, as I alluded to already, the voice handling is actually done in hardware. It's done by the FPGA on the card. So in order to break out of that, that's a change to hardware. And another thing, this is again a fairly basic point, but again important to understand that in the HDX world, the AAX DSP plugins are hosted on the DSP chips on the card, and AAX native plugins are hosted on the CPU. So using AX native plugins in some circumstances does actually use up voices to handle this hop between the DSP domain and the native domain, and that's sort of what I want to show on this next slide. So we've got a very basic representation of our Pro Tools HDX system. So we're just going to talk about playback at the moment, keep things simple. So you're playing back audio. It comes from disk, obviously. Then that's handled by the CPU because obviously your drives are attached to your computer. So that's your audio goes through the CPU and then onto the HDX mixer and then out of your I/O. So if you put a native plugin before a DSP plugin, then we're not using any of these additional voices. And this is something which, you know, a lot of HDX users understand some of these principles and know how to kind of use the HDX system efficiently. But actually there's a lot of people maybe who don't sort of use it in its most efficient way. And I think, again, that's sometimes where people can get into problems. So if you're running on your HDX system, you put a native plugin on, then because the audio is going through the CPU first, then you can do the native processing there before it gets to the HDX mixer. However, if you put a native plugin after a DSP plugin, it requires a voice to hop from the HDX DSP domain back to the CPU, do the processing, and then go back to the HDX mixer. Also, if you put a native plugin on an aux input or a master fader, both of which are running on the HDX mixer, again, it uses up voices to hop from the DSP domain to the native domain and back again. So with the HDX system, there are 64 hidden voices which help to facilitate this workflow. So basically what it does, those voices are reserved. So they don't impact your 256 voices that are available to you. They're there in the background, but actually it's possible to exceed that 64 count and start eating into the usable voices in your session. Again, something which is sort of going on in the background and maybe is invisible to some users, and they don't sort of realize that that's actually going on. Another thing to bear in mind is that in this scenario, these hops add a lot of latency. So as you're jumping from the DSP domain to the native domain and back again, you're adding latency which is double your hardware buffer size. So again, that can have maybe unseen implications if you're trying to track and so on. So this is where I'm going to hand over to Dan, and he's going to unveil the hybrid engine and how that's going to solve all of our problems.
All right, thanks very much, Dave. Hopefully you've got my screen there now.
We do.
And excellent. So yeah, we just wanted to give a little introduction to how the DSP's been working up to now and cover a couple of the concepts that will make it easier to understand the improvements that we're making to the system. Already I've seen some really great questions coming in, so we'll try and touch on a few of them as we go through, but I want to make sure that we get through this in a decent amount of time so we can get onto some of those really great questions. So again, I think covering how we've been using HDX to our advantage now with that determinism also helps us understand why we still use that DSP in the hybrid engine system. So the hybrid engine was a concept and technology that was introduced with Pro Tools Carbon. And while we're taking some time to explain all of this, it's actually pretty straightforward. The mixer runs on the CPU, and really when we require, we put tracks into DSP mode, and that moves them and their processing over to the DSP chips to give you a really low latency path. I think probably most people watching understand that concept of latency, but simply to say on the DSP, due to the fact it's dedicated to that function, has a really short time between the input processing and then output. Obviously, a CPU is fantastic at being extremely flexible, but with each plugin change in buffer size, that time between the input to the output gets longer and longer, which doesn't suit recording in a real-time situation. Now, Carbon uses the same DSP as the HDX card, And so the obvious next step and progression, as also Pro Tools runs both of them, is to bring this technology over to the HDX card. So to give a bit of a primer on the hybrid engine, in this example, excuse me just for a second. In this example, we're running our all of our mixer and all of our processing on the native mixer. And the output of that native mixer is streaming directly to the outputs of our hardware. And this is actually important because this gives us an even lower system delay than we have when we're running all on the DSP and having to go between the native and the DSP all the time. So that's a nice point there. But let's say that we've got this really busy session filled with maybe a lot of virtual instruments. You've already done 90% of your mix. Those kind of situations, you're probably at maximum buffer size. Perhaps you're already struggling but to get all the processing happening. But you need that low latency path. That's when you use the DSP mode, and it takes that channel and all the channels that are downstream from, or the tracks downstream from the track that you enable. And this is then on the DSP chips, which gives you that super low latency path. And actually from the session earlier today, I guess it's good to point out that that's independent of what's going on in the native mixer. You can have your native mixer you know, at the highest buffer size with tons of plugins, but once you move that track over to the DSP, the processing then is done on the DSP and delivered in that, you know, sub-millisecond, depending on your plugins, of course, time frame, rather than having to go through all of that processing. So that's really where the power is. As Dave mentioned earlier, the CPU and RAM in modern computers is really good at doing certain kinds of things, like virtual instruments, like reverbs, other audio processing like noise reduction, which are kind of hard to do on DSP. But what that gives us usually is long latency times. So with DSP mode, we simply enable that and it moves that track and its plugins over to the DSP for that low latency path. So let's have a quick look at what that might look like in Pro Tools on our system and our system usage. All right. So on the left-hand side, we have HDX Classic, and we're just calling it that because this is how it's worked up until now, and it's much easier to talk about something if it has a name. So we can see in this case, this is actually a Atmos session, and it's got a pretty large number of tracks, but you can see that in this other system, there's 3 HDX cards, and they are almost all being used completely. And actually, of our 512 voices available, we're using 405 of that. But it's interesting to see when we open the same session on using the hybrid engine, we are actually using far less voices because we aren't having to deal with all of these hops between the native domain and the DSP domain. And in this case, with a little bit of load balancing, we're using one of the 3 HDX cards. So, what I mean by load balancing is simply there may be some plugins that there's a DSP version of, and you want to run those tracks in DSP mode just to take a bit of load off the computer CPU. But the hybrid engine, and we'll get to the voices in a minute, has a long way to grow. Whereas the HDX Classic, even with 3 cards, is really hitting that physical limitation that we talked about earlier, those physical limitations on the card that mean it can only do so many voices and only has so much processing, as we mentioned. So that takes us on to DSP mode on the system. And we'll have a little look at this in Pro Tools as well. But just to go over this really quickly, the light green is DSP mode. And that's a track that you've selected to put in DSP mode. And that moves that track over to the DSP. Now, when you're in DSP mode, only AAX DSP plugins can run. A native plugin will be converted to an AAX DSP version if it's available, or bypassed. And that's important because we want to keep that low latency path. Otherwise, there wouldn't be much point in putting it in DSP mode. Now, when we're in native mode, or a native mode on a track, then only the AAX native plugins run. Now, it is possible to do what we call DSP mode safe, which allows us to do something like from a DSP enabled track, we want to do a send to something like a reverb or a delay, or something that doesn't matter if it's got a little bit of that latency in there. So those are the modes we have. And as you can see in my diagram, we have like a bright green color. The dark green colors, as we have the note there, is auto enabled. It just means that it's downstream from that DSP plugin that we've enabled. Now, some of you might have noticed this actually on the system usage window before, but what this does is we're now freed up from some of the physical limitations of the HDX hardware. So previously with an HDX3 system, you would end up with a maximum voice count of the physical limitation of the card. So now what we're going to be able to do, because the mixer is based in the native domain, is have 2048 voices available. And this is a significant increase on any system that we've had available before, native or DSP. Now, the other thing that's really cool about this is 2048 voices, and that doesn't matter how many HDX cards you've got, and it also isn't affected by sample rate. Just as a very quick example, with one card, you would have 256 voices at 48K, but if you wanted to run at 192, you're recording a classical recording or something like that where you wanted that high sample rate, you'd only have 64 voices available, which could be really limiting, especially not only tracking when you come to mix later. So to make full use of this new increase in voice count, we have also upped the audio track count to 2048 audio tracks. But I think here is where I wanted to stop and just clarify something. As Dave went over before, we have this idea of voices and tracks. But as he mentioned before, that a voice is when we are doing a couple of certain things. We're either streaming audio from a disc for a playback track or potentially recording to disc, or we're in one of these situations where we're doing a hop between the native realm and the DSP realm. So I guess what I wanted to point out is even with the system that you have now and the track count and the voice count that you have, it's not only whatever the number is you have now or 2048, it's actually 2048 plus the auxiliary tracks, plus the master tracks, plus the instrument tracks. So we're starting to talk about absolutely potentially enormous sessions. Now, of course, how well that plays back or not is going to be affected by your CPU power, but what it does give you is just an absolute massive amount of flexibility that wasn't possible before. And yeah, that's just something I wanted to cover off there. But we've been looking at slides for a little while, so let's move over to Pro Tools.
I wonder whether there's a couple of questions come in. We could sort of maybe, whilst we're talking about these things,
Yes,
just discuss a couple of them, and then we'll certainly
sure.
be doing some more questions as we towards the end. I thought there was one interesting one was about the impact upon heavy virtual instrument users, and I'm going to defer to one of our venerable beta testers who is as heavy a virtual instrument user as I know, just creates gigantic scores. And okay, so he's got an all singing, all dancing Mac Pro, but he absolutely loves the hybrid engine because he's getting all the benefit of that CPU power, and because then the mixer is sitting on the CPU and not sitting on the cards, you're getting a much better experience with virtual instruments. And in fact, what we've found is because of all the work we've done for the to writing the HD drivers that we do, we actually get a better native experience than you would do if you're running just a conventional sort of core audio or ASIO interface. So I think actually, if you're a heavy virtual instrument user, then you're going to find real benefit in the hybrid engine.
I think,
Yeah.
Dave, actually, this has been something that I've experienced as we've been looking at the hybrid engine, but also with the same concept on Carbon, where I've had quite my CPU really on an older machine getting near its maximum capability to play back all those virtual instruments, but then I wanted to like sing a few lines or play a bit of bass or something like that, and I could put that track in DSP mode and instantly have that super low latency track while the CPU was busy doing the things that it's good at with those virtual instruments and all those RAMs. So I think that's exactly it. I think in most cases, for someone that's a heavy virtual instrument user or any really CPU intensive process, this is going to be a much better experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's lots more coming in. Maybe we'll just do one more to discuss. So there's one about, will there be some type of automatic optimization by the hybrid engine to reconfigure and optimize the handoff between the computer and the cards? I thought that was interesting because, I mean, essentially that's what all the work that we put into the hybrid engine is all about. We want to make that transition from DSP mode to native mode and back again as seamless as possible. And actually, maybe we should sort of jump into demo because you're going to show that in your session, Dan. And I think there's an awful lot of complex stuff going on in the background, a lot of clever engineering that's gone on to make this work. To you as the user, you just press a button and it just does its thing. And I think that's the really cool thing about this. So maybe we should we'll do that, and so we'll come back and answer more questions.
Cool. So hopefully you can see my Pro Tools screen now.
Yep.
Awesome. So my session is extremely simple, but it's really just to make a couple of illustrations about a few things. So I've been speaking to you through Pro Tools this entire time, and actually we're sitting in native mode right now, as we can see from our little discussion earlier. This is in gray, which means that it's currently in native mode, and we can see that although I have an HDX One system here using the Thunderbolt 3 chassis from Avid, and I'm not using any DSP. That's all completely available. So what I'm going to do is take my voice here and pop it into DSP. So I've left this message here. Of course, you can disable it. So DSP mode has been enabled for a track, and it means that the tracks downstream from this, as we mentioned in the earlier part, have been automatically placed into DSP mode, this darker green color, because they're downstream from my voice and we want them to be as low latency as possible. So we can see here we now are in DSP mode, and all of my plugins, and obviously a lot of Avid plugins are in DSP mode, but we have a lot of great third-party plugins as well, McDSP, Plugin Alliance, some of the Focusrite stuff as well. There's a lot of fantastic plugins available for this architecture, and so I'm now in DSP mode. But I think to try and show this now, normally we would have trade shows and be able to go into stores and try this out for ourselves with Carbon or the HDX hybrid engine when it's available. But I just wanted to try and show a little bit what this is like. If I'm a musician, if I'm someone doing a voiceover, all I want to do is to hear my voice as quickly as I can, because the more delay, the more latency we have between my voice going through the microphone and coming back to my monitoring, the more off-putting it is. And so to try and demonstrate that just a little bit, I've actually got the same track, as you can probably see here, going into two channels. Now, one, they've got exactly the same plugins, and I'm just going to unmute the native one, and you'll hear the difference in timing, and it's probably a little off-putting. And you can imagine if you're trying to record a voiceover, that or play an instrument in time, that would actually be quite off-putting as you're trying to record in time, or just listen to your voiceover without that kind of latency. And this is what it's all about, really, is let the CPU do what it's great at. But when you need a low latency path, put it in DSP mode. So while we're explaining a lot, it is pretty simple. But I thought there's a nice visual way that I can show this as well. I've actually got the same tracks bust out of my system. And I'm going to turn this, unmute this again, sorry, so you're going to hear a double up. But I actually just wanted to record for a second. And, sorry, I put it on input, not record, excuse me. And just record just a little bit and maybe make a couple of small transients, because it's going to be really easy to see. Now, if I go in here and zoom in, and I will actually mute this other track because it's probably a little bit annoying, you can see the difference in arrival time between the output of a DSP enabled track and the output of the native track. There's a significant difference. That's as we could all imagine, that would be quite off-putting for someone you're recording in a voiceover, a voiceover as well. That would be really off-putting. And another small example I have here is to sort of show what that might be like if you're playing something that is rhythmic. So I've got another Pro Tools system here, and I'm just playing like a drum loop of just some drums. And let me get the system playing over here. I'm going to unmute these, and at the moment they'll just be in native mode. And you can hear that when I unmute them and play them together, of course, they're playing exactly in time. But I'm going to pop one of these tracks now into DSP mode. It's actually got a very similar chain of plugins to my voiceover track. And now I'm going to play this again, and you're going to hear the difference between on something that's percussive, and it's going to make, I think, a really obvious difference, that the timing is offset from each other. So now when I activate that DSP on both channels, of course, it's exactly back in time again. It's just a really simple demonstration, but really same thing with Carbon as well, Pro Tools Carbon, but the HDX hybrid engine, putting on a pair of headphones and listening through a microphone, the difference between the native realm and the DSP, or the DSP domain and the native domain is really, really telling. So that's just something that I wanted to show really quickly in Pro Tools. It's quite simple, but I think it helps us understand why this would be. Now, again, it's a simple session, but I could have a ton of virtual instruments or a ton of plugins running. But when I put these things in DSP mode, it gives me that super low latency path. So I think, Dave, unless we had something else we wanted to follow up with on the questions, you were going to jump into something.
Yeah, let's show a sort of a different example, another way to use it. But as I say, I think that's just a great example. Just, you know, with all those plugins you've got on there, just pressing that button. I mean, it's just like a second or two, and what's going on in the background is actually there's a lot of work, you know, going on, moving plugins to the DSP and back again. But to you, at the user, it's just it's pretty seamless. So I'm going to just share a different Pro Tools session. So what I'm going to do is just set this up quickly. Is show you. Hopefully, can you see my Pro Tools screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So this is our tried and tested Agent MX0 session, which is one of our demo sessions we've been using for a while. And I chose it just because it's a good example of it. It's a decent sized post session. You've got plenty of dialogue tracks. Then we move down. We've got all of our music tracks all broken out into separate instruments. Many of them actually running live as virtual instruments, down to our effects, backgrounds and Foley, and then finally down to my stems and print tracks down at the bottom. Okay, so this, as I say, it's a decent sized session. So if I now move over to the mixer, if I move, you can see as I go through the session, if I move over to the left, sort of some of the playback tracks, you can see that they're in native mode. So the plugins in native mode, the tracks in native mode, that's just sitting on the DSP. So what I've chosen to do in this case is when I get down towards the end of the session where all my stems, my print masters and so on are, if I just move that along there, it's a bigger session than I thought. There we go. My stems, my print masters and so on, I've put them all into DSP mode. So what I wanted to do really was, there's a couple of things I suppose. One is sort of offloading some of that work to the DSP using what sort of Dan referred to as load balancing. But also, because these are print tracks, then I've actually put them into DSP mode. And I think a question actually came up about this, but I'm using the blue mode as I would do on an HDX system. And if I sort of monitor those print tracks, maybe using a matrix or something like that, then I'm going to be able to switch between playback and input without any latency. So making use of the low latency for that purpose. So if I look at my system now, so I'm using say a little over half of the HDX card itself. And I'm using that. There's some mixer processing going on because I'm doing some routing. I've got some plugins there, for my chains, my stems, just some EQ, some limiting, some compression, and so on. So I'm just kind of making use of the DSP that I have now. If I open this up on an HDX system, then most likely the vast majority of that card would be used by the mixer, and I wouldn't have any DSP left for running plugins or anything else. So this is really where the hybrid engine comes into play. It's that hybrid of the mixer running on the CPU, but offloading parts of it onto the DSP chips where it makes sense. So it gives us this amazing sort of ability to work with the best of the worlds, but the best of both worlds, and that's what the hybrid engine really is all about. Yeah. So with that, so if we move back in, sorry, yeah, go down.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's a lot of really great questions coming in, and one that keeps coming up. I guess where did we want to get to it, Dave? But when and how is this available? I guess that's one.
Should we? I tell you what. Let's go. Let's just do a little bit of comparison. We've got between hybrid engine and HDX Classic. Let's get through that, and then let's dig into how and when you get it, because I know that people really want to know that. So if I just switch back to good old PowerPoint for a moment there. So and it's just a bit of a summary really of I guess some of the pros and cons of working with HDX versus the hybrid engine. And we've talked about this before, but this what you get with the HDX engine, with the Classic, is it's a predictable performance, but it's limited by the card in the ways that we talked about. Again, voicing is part of the hardware, so again it's a limitation. Native processing can consume voices, but then you've got the plus side that you can mix and match DSP and native plugins within certain constraints. Multi-channel mixing can consume a DSP, as we talked about, but on the plus side, the DSP restores itself the same every time. If I'm working in room A with an HDX2 system, I save my session, move into room B, open it the next day, then it's going to open up in exactly the same way, and that's not always the case with the CPU. So if we look to the hybrid engine, the performance is based on the CPU. So your choice of CPU does come into play, possibly more than it would have done for an HDX system. But I think possibly that's true for most people these days anyway. But because we're doing the voicing on the host, not the card, we've got this massive voice increase and track increase, and making use of the native mixer. We're not using up voices, we're not incurring additional latency with these hops back and forwards between domains, and that's again a really important point. And our native mixer is efficient, scalable, and then we can add the DSP in for load balancing. So as I say, these are kind of, I think some of these are pros and cons, and maybe at this point it's really important to say that as an HDX user, all you do is you check a box to turn the native engine on, and you uncheck it to turn it off again. It's really very, very simple. So you really have the choice of working in the way that you want to work. And just kind of the last sort of slide, as it were, is that I think we wanted to, maybe think of some examples where, well, maybe why would you turn the hybrid engine off? You might be running a really complex music tracking session. You want all your paths to be low latency. And if you can run that within the limitations of the HDX mixer, then why not just turn the hybrid engine off and use HDX in that way? That's absolutely fine. You might be running an older CPU, and again, you might prefer that predictability that you're used to getting with HDX. Again, that's absolutely fine. And possibly, running Pro Tools as a separate recorder. Your routing is not going to be an issue. Plugins are not going to be an issue. So again, it's down to that sort of low latency workflow. And again, there's no reason why you can't sort of turn the hybrid engine off and on. And I think that's the real beauty of this, is that you have the choice to work in whatever way you want to work. So with that, I think, Dan, the question on everyone's lips is, how do I get the hybrid engine?
Excellent. So I'm just going to steal the screen share just for a second, and just let you know that hopefully you can see that now, that actually this is already, sorry, let me expand that out a little, is already available. Quite a lot of information is available on our website already about hybrid engine, and when it's going to be available. And if we have a look through there, we will see that essentially we're planning for this release later this month, and that if we look also at the frequently asked questions about the hybrid engine, so if you're wanting some more details, I definitely recommend going to have a look over there. But essentially, I'm really happy to say there's nothing else required except for the latest up-to-date version of Pro Tools when we release it, and so that you're on a current subscription or you have an up-to-date update and support plan, then you're going to be able to get these features to use with your HDX card or with your Carbon. So I think that the other point that I wanted to touch on, this reminds me of this, is to really remember what this gives us. I've seen the questions come up, and we'll get to some more questions because there's some really good ones, but what this really gives us is this amazing flexibility. Pro Tools is the same mixer, the same sonic quality between the native versions, the DSP versions, the mixer algorithms, and all of that system underneath are the same. So the system, that the Pro Tools session that you build on your laptop will also work with Carbon. It will also work with Hybrid Engine, and that is so flexible because when you're on the move, your laptop or your plugins are going to be available, and all that for when you're out on the road or you're in a more compact situation. But when you need to record, you can use Carbon, or if you have an HDX system with that HDX hybrid engine, to get that really high performance of CPU power, but that low latency when you need it. And I guess that's the thing that's popped up in the questions a couple of times, but really it's that thing of trust the native engine and all its delay compensation to do its job. And then when you need it for you're recording someone, or you need to monitor something, or you have a hardware insert that's relying on external gear, there's examples like that where of course you want to put it into DSP mode to get that as small amount of latency or delay in input to output time as possible. So I just wanted to touch on those few things. So I think that's really cool that everyone who has the hardware capable of this, an HDX card, and is up to date on the software, is going to have this feature really soon. So yeah, I think that's a pretty easy answer to the question of who gets it and when do they get it. Relatively soon, and anyone who's eligible to get the latest release of software when it comes out.
Yep, so just make sure your subscription is up to date, your upgrade plan is up to date, and you're all good to go. So it's not long to wait now. I think the other thing actually that I guess what you're showing there reminds us as well, but well, I guess one thing we wanted to highlight is that we did introduce 2 new pieces of hardware at the beginning of last year. That was the expansion chassis. Dan's already mentioned that. I'm using the same chassis. So there's the desktop and rack mount version. I've got mine set up with a Mac Mini on one side and an HDX card on the other. Hooked it up to a Matrix Studio. It's a really kind of neat solution for a modern HDX system, and with the efficiency of the hybrid engine, perhaps you don't need to have sort of so many multi-card systems, because you're offloading some of that work to the CPU and mixing and matching and so on. So these Thunderbolt 3 chassis bundles actually definitely work really well with this hybrid engine workflow. And then of course you add to that the new SyncX peripheral for frame edge sync, and you've got a perfect post setup for everything up to Dolby Atmos. So yeah, definitely we wanted to highlight that one as well while we're here.
Absolutely.
So we have some great questions coming in. So I think one. So there's one here, and I think you've kind of answered it, Dan. But I do think it's worth saying. Someone's asked, can you touch on delay compensation, how it's handled in the new engine for post-production, where we require everything to be in sync? And I think what you said, Dan, was absolutely right. Is that basically you just trust the system, because I mean delay compensation is something that's been in the Pro Tools software for an awfully long time. So we have we've been refining it for all those years, both in the native and the DSP domains. So we know, as obviously the engineers who are designing all this stuff, they know exactly sort of how the Pro Tools mixer works. So as they're designing this system, they know that when they're moving from one domain to another, what needs to be changed on the delay compensation side and so on. So again, without sort of delving into some areas that probably are going to fry your brain, I think we have to sort of say we trust the amazing people who create the Pro Tools software, because obviously delay compensation is absolutely critical to everybody who's doing any kind of audio mixing, whether that's music or post. If your delay compensation is off, then bad things happen. So as I say, exactly. Trust it.
And I think we'll probably ask for some of our other team members to maybe pop up a couple of questions they think have been answered but might be worth sort of answering live. I saw an interesting one, like, how does this affect my options for my system? I mean, as I said, the great thing is if you have HDX cards, this already works. But I suppose this is where you end up with this situation that you have this amazing power with the HDX hybrid engine, but also because it's got that DigiLink connector and the interfaces that are available from Avid and a few others out there, you really get to choose how to build that system and scale it up and down. And one card may be enough, but there may be some circumstances when you do need more, you are using more DSP, or you need more IO, and you're going to be able to expand that up and down. So, if you do have an HDX3 system, then you're going to be in a really good place. You're going to have plenty of DSP available and all of that potential IO as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so important, that the HDX has always given us that kind of expanded IO options, as well as the DSP and the voice handling, all the other things it does. So yeah, absolutely. DSP cards, that's the way you're going to get all those that high IO count with a Pro Tools system. So yeah. Essentially that doesn't change really.
There's a bunch of really questions that are slightly off the hybrid engine topic. We're really looking at the hybrid engine topic today. And after the next Pro Tools release, there will be a number of other things that we will need to touch on, and we'll be scheduling another webinar, and also making sure that that information gets out there. So apologies if we're not answering your question directly, but we can't always answer certain things ahead of a release. But with the hybrid engine, we know it's definitely happening, and we've all been using it with great results. So apologies if your specific question isn't getting answered, but rest assured that we'll make sure there's good information available with the next release that answers some of the questions that are being asked, a number of interesting and well-placed questions that will get some nice answers with the next release of software.
Yeah. So one thing actually, there's a couple of questions that have come up around virtual instrument workflows. I think actually this is an important one to address because, you know, the low latency DSP path is all about audio tracking. Okay, so you know, we don't have instruments that run on DSPs. It's just not it's not a feasible workflow. Native CPU is the perfect place to host a VI. So that is one scenario where you do need to do some juggling with your with the native side. You will need to bring your hardware buffer size down in order to get you know, sort of good VI performance. So, but again, it's still, to me, using the native engine, it feels like it's more. It is actually running very efficiently, and actually bringing down my hardware buffer size has been less of an issue. And of course, you know, we're showing sort of higher hardware buffer sizes to kind of demonstrate the, you know, kind of make clear the issues of latency and so on. But I think it's, you know, important to recognize that the low latency workflows and so on are very much about audio recording. And if you are tracking with VIs, then you do have to manage that buffer size. But as I say, I do think you're getting a better experience with the hybrid engine than you would have done with HDX. I'm absolutely 100% sure on that one.
And it is interesting. I think it popped up in the first time we ran through the webinar, but that, you know, if we're running on a native engine, is there if I'm not using a lot of DSP mode tracks, am I going to see a huge benefit? And actually, in my personal testing so far, the same session opening just using core audio versus the same session opening using HDX hybrid engine, because of those really deeply integrated drivers with the hardware, it does seem to operate significantly more efficiently on exactly the same session. So again, like Dave said, with those kind of virtual instrument kinds of sessions, and that was the session I was checking with, I saw a nearly threefold increase in average CPU usage by running on the core audio, whereas with the HDX hybrid engine, I saw significantly less CPU load. And that's all to do with it having that really direct communication with the outputs for the hardware.
Yeah, there is one here actually. I think we should answer because we may well have said it already anyway. But will this large voice count also be implemented in an HD native system? And the answer is yes. Yeah. So if you are a Pro Tools Ultimate user who's running an HD native system or running a Core Audio or ASIO interface, then you will benefit from the increased voice count. So everybody who's running Pro Tools Ultimate will get 2048 voices as of the next release, which is, I think, is good news for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was a question here, Dan. I don't know if we want to kind of delve into this a little bit around sort of Dolby Atmos workflows, and I guess the implications of the hybrid engine for Dolby Atmos workflows. And
sure,
you know, there's a number of different ways of working with Atmos. You know, whether you've got an external renderer running on a separate computer, or you're running the production suite, and there's a couple of different options of getting audio to and from the production suite from the renderer.
Sure.
So I don't know if we want to maybe explore that a little bit, because I know obviously
Sure.
Dolby Atmos is a big topic of conversation right now.
Absolutely. I mean, there's some people raising some really good points about the Dolby Audio Bridge, using that as the playback engine, and how does that affect your usage of the system. So I think obviously with some of the announcements in recent days, obviously Atmos Music has got a lot of attention, and I think in most scenarios, you know, you're going to record your band in a fairly typical way generally, in that you'll use that hybrid engine to get those low latency paths when you need it. But when you come to mixing, then you really do have that, using the Dolby Audio Bridge, you use that native processing that's available to do the mixing side of things. If you're all on a all-in-one system, of course, if you're in a larger system where you have an external renderer, of course, you're going to have significantly better performance and be able to deal with much larger sessions when you're sending out to that external renderer through the hardware. And I think already we're seeing from some of our beta testers that work in that kind of work, they're seeing really significant increases to the flexibility and the power of the same systems that they had before.
No, absolutely. So we've got a couple of people asking, and this, strictly speaking, is something which we're looking forward to as part of the next release. But you know, people do want to know about some aspects of the HDX mixer and whether they'll be available with the native mixer, specifically around sidechain delay compensation.
Yeah.
So, do we want to delve into that one?
That's an interesting one. I think of anyone who would understand how a mixer works would understand that we need to, if we are running on a native mixer, we have to figure out how that works and make that work. We'll have some more definitive news in the not too distant future on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, without giving anything away, I think parity between the mixers is of utmost importance to us. So you can read into that what you will, and just say the announcements will be coming very soon, and we'll also be running another one of these Tech Talk webinars, delving much more deeply into the rather long list of features and things to discuss when it comes to the next release of Pro Tools. So I'm looking forward to that one. Yeah, so we've got a minute or two left. I was going to say we've got, if there's anything else that we want to pick
I guess just it's sort of that same concept that keeps coming up. I use this kind of plugin from this manufacturer. How many DSP plugins are available? Those kind of questions. There's sort of two answers to that. One, remember to trust the mixer to do what it does. When you're mixing after you've recorded, you may not need those tracks to be in DSP mode, so just use whichever plugins that you like to use. It's when you put it in that low latency mode and you're tracking and you need the appropriate plugins for there, that's where you've got to be a little bit more careful about your plugin choice. But absolutely, if there's a plugin manufacturer that you really like, absolutely get in touch with them and tell them that you would love for them to have their plugins available on the HDX, on the AAX DSP platform. It's certainly available out there for people to code for if they would like to.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, as you say, this kind of just breaks open the possibilities with HDX. So we have just about reached the top of the hour. It's your last chance to maybe throw a few questions at us. Otherwise, and as I say, thanks to Jeff and to Gil for their amazing work in the background, frantically typing answers to your questions and passing some through to us. So we really appreciate the effort, and all the people out on the social media stream. So, as I say, we'll be continuing to do more of these. We're going to be doing what we're calling these Pro Tools Tech Talk webinars, which is more about digging into maybe new features, new releases, and so on. But also our community plugins are something which have been very successful, and we've got some great sort of guests lined up. And I know people are really interested to hear how you know, their peers and other people in the industry are working and how they're using Pro Tools. So again, we've got more of those things lined up. So really appreciate so many of you coming and joining this webinar, and we'll see you again on the next one. So thank you very much.
Thank you.